Welcome to Civilnet. My guest is Professor Keith Watenpaugh, who heads the Human Rights Initiative at the University of California, Davis, and he teaches there as well, and he's a historian of the modern Middle East, which of course means that he has to explain an unexplainable part of the world to the rest of the world. Keith, thank you for joining us.
You're welcome, Sophie. Great to join.
Thank you. Pariyegar. I'm going to ask you to try to explain Haleptzis to non-Haleptzis. We're looking today at a world of news where not only is Syria on the brink of falling apart, but Aleppo, which so far had seemed perhaps really insulated as most Haleptzis hoped it was. And today we're seeing that not only is it not insulated, but it is at risk of fragmenting, falling apart, and being really very dangerous for everyone who lives in Aleppo, including, of course, the old and not so small Armenian community there.
Well, I mean, the first thing to say is I used to live in Aleppo. For several years, I lived near the old train station. I lived with an Armenian grandmother, Alice Mamik, and I think my first book, Being Modern in the Middle East, is about the Aleppan middle class. And the commercial and white-collar middle class of Aleppo is something that really distinguishes the city from Damascus, in fact, from many other Middle Eastern cities. And I think this is why what's going on there is so important in terms of the internal dynamics of this civil war in Syria. For a long time, the Christian and Sunni middle and upper middle class merchants, businessmen, white-collar professionals have really stood on the sidelines of the civil war. And I think that the occupation of several of the neighborhoods of Aleppo is an attempt to either force their hand, to force them to come over to the rebel side. And I think that the government of Syria really is at an important turning point here, because if it loses or is seen or perceived to have lost in Aleppo, that the upper middle class Sunni business elite of the city will defect to the other side.
You know, I don't understand civil war, so it's really difficult for me to understand. The middle class that you're talking about is, of course, also where the Armenian minority fits by and large. And so when you're talking about taking over neighborhoods and trying to convince them to come over to the rebel side, let's say my neighborhood agreed to go over to the rebel side. Does that make my life any easier today?
No, that makes your life really terrible right now, in fact. I mean, the problem here is, from the strategic perspective of the Free Syrian Army and the rebels, is that at the start of this civil war, if you will, for the most part, they were defending home turf against assaults by the government.
Right.
What happened in Damascus last week and is happening in Aleppo now is that they are attacking Syrian government positions in neighborhoods been relatively peaceful, and they certainly have loyalty to the opposition, but they haven't been scenes of violence. And so I think that the Free Syrian Army may be overplaying its hand at this moment, because what they're doing is unnecessarily exposing civilians to harm, whereas before they were protecting civilians. I mean, the current count from the UN right now is 200,000 Aleppans have fled as internally displaced people, either to other parts of Aleppo or south towards Damascus.
200,000?
200,000 refugees right now from the city of Aleppo. Aleppo has 4 million people.
Yes.
So still a tiny portion of the entire city. Think about it. Aleppo is the size of Chicago.
Aleppo is the size of Armenia.
Right. Aleppo is the size of Armenia, right? And I think that in terms of the geography of the city, of course, Armenians are concentrated really in 3 neighborhoods. And none of these neighborhoods have come under attack. I mean, I think they've been fairly insulated at this point and are still fairly safe from the bulk of the fighting. But, you know, we don't know what's going to happen over the next week or so.
You know, all of us who've been watching Aleppo over these months, for obvious reasons, for connections, personal and community, have had a hard time understanding that middle class has not itself understood that it is at risk, where they continued to believe that somehow all of this would pass by them. And now that they're face to face with it, they're really hostages of their own middle classness, right? You can't sell your home, you can't sell your business. how do you protect yourself? How do you even think of leaving?
Well, the issue, I think, for the Aleppo middle class is that they were some of the prime beneficiaries of economic liberalization by Bashar al-Assad. To them, he was the devil that they knew, and these FSA, who are the dominant class in the FSA, are rural, lower class, agrarian, small village people. And they really think are afraid that the privileges they've had in Syrian society, maybe not privileges isn't the right word, the access to banking, to trade that they had.
The normalcy that they've had.
Right, that might disappear if he leaves. So I think they were willing to tolerate the tyranny of the Assad government as long as they were able to maintain their middle class status and able to engage in trade. Now, what the civil war is showing is that Assad is unable to protect that status. And once they make the choice, once they come to the conclusion that Bashar al-Assad is now unable to protect their status, you'll see increasing defections. And we really haven't seen major defections from the Sunni and Armenian and Christian upper middle class of Aleppo yet, but I think it's only a matter of time. On the other hand, the Syrian government will win the Battle of Aleppo, and I'm absolutely certain of this. I mean, they will rout the rebels. The rebels have only small arms. They don't have aircraft. They don't have air support from Turkey or from other Western countries. So they will lose this battle. But the question is whether or not this will persuade the middle class of the city to move over to the other side. At which point, I think it'll be very difficult for for Bashar al-Assad to continue to rule in Syria.
You know, it's very difficult to imagine or picture the situation in Syria which is so different from Lebanon in that the Armenian political parties were not allowed to exist and function. And so today, that community in many ways lacks the political leadership, sophistication, nuance that is required in order to play the middle in this very tough and daily changing game.
Okay, the Armenians of Aleppo, as survivors of the genocide, have been very adept at surviving Syria. And in the 20s and 30s, they navigated between Arab nationalists and the French colonial government. In the period after independence, they've been able to coexist with nationalists, with Nasserist, and with Ba'athist governments. And I think that the two leading political or social political groupings in a place like Aleppo, of course, are the Armenian General Benevolent Union, the AGBU, and the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, the Tashnaks, who both operate fairly extensive cultural organizations, which, in my opinion, and in times of stress, can operate to produce solidarity within the Armenian community. I mean, my concern is that both of these organizations, the AGBU being more middle class and actually more liberal, and the Armenian Revolutionary Federation also being a party that in the past has supported political liberation, have been unwilling, in fact, they've been quite to the contrary, to try to initiate transitional dialogue with the Syrian government. In other words, they've stood by pretty strongly the current government. And I think that they're not reflecting the diversity of Armenian opinion in a place like Aleppo, where you have people who want to explore the possibility of a more democratic Syria. Now, my thought is that for a minority like Aleppo, a Syria that abides by human rights and is more democratic and where citizenship really matters, Armenians could do very well in that kind of country. I don't know if that's what the Free Syrian Army's political project is. I mean, I don't know if these people, or the dominant group within the FSA, or still Sunni Islamists, would really incorporate Armenians as equal citizens into a post-Assad Syria. But I do know that what's happening now in Syria is increasingly making life untenable for Armenians, and the Armenian leadership needs to create a strategy that will either preserve the integrity of the Armenian community there, or probably begin to make preparations for helping Armenians leave Syria if they want to leave Syria.
Last question. I don't know that you want to take it, but you also know the Republic of Armenia. And, you know, governments are limited in their ability to maneuver in situations like this because you are, after all, having to deal with this other, you know, colleague president who may or may not be around in the next several years, and you don't want to misspeak. What do you think the Armenian government can safely do to both make its presence known to the Armenian community and also play its cards right with the Syrian political forces?
Well, I mean, of course, Armenia always has to be the safe haven for Armenians worldwide. I mean, it plays an important role. And, you know, after the Iraq War, Iraqi Armenians came to Armenia. I mean, there is some sense that they were not treated very well, but Armenia became on to Western Europe or the Americas. And I think that the Republic still has to play that role, that Armenians always need to be certain that they could find at least respite in Armenia, even if they're transiting onto other places. Armenia, I think that Armenia needs to maintain a fairly neutral role at this point. And I think in that regard, they should be reaching out to all sides of the international community, saying that they're prepared to help humanitarian relief, that they're also prepared to accept refugees either on a temporary or permanent basis. But I think that the Armenian community of Aleppo at the moment is safe, but it's near danger. But the coming weeks and coming months will be a time of terrible trial for them. And we may, at the end of the next 2 or 3 years, see the final exodus of Armenians from Syria.
Well, I'm not sure I'm surprised by what you say, but I'm not sure I'm happy to hear it either. We've been speaking with Keith Watenpaugh, who is a scholar of the modern Middle East, who has lived in Aleppo, knows the Armenian community well. And we've been speaking about the dilemmas facing Armenians in Syria generally and in Aleppo specifically. And Keith, I would like to say thank you and also ask that we speak with you again in the weeks and months to come.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.